They tell you the cold is the thing that kills you up here. That's what the orientation packet says, in the section about exposure and hypothermia and the way your body lies to you in the final stages, telling you you're warm when you're already dying. They give you a lot of information about the cold. They don't tell you about the quiet. I've thought about how to start telling this for a long time now. Months. Maybe longer. My sense of time isn't what it used to be, and I'll explain why, or I'll try to. The trouble is that there's no clean place to begin. Nothing announced itself. There was no moment where the world tilted and I understood that I'd stepped into something wrong. It came the way frost comes onto a window. You don't see it move. You only ever see that it has moved, that the glass is no longer clear, and you can't remember the last moment it was. So I'll just start with the road. The contract came through a placement service that handles federal and quasi-federal environmental postings. Weather monitoring, hydrology, remote sensing, that kind of work. I had the qualifications: atmospheric science degree, 2 seasons at a station in the Brooks Range foothills, a clean record and no dependents, and a documented tolerance for isolation. That last part matters more than people think. They screen for it. There are psychological questionnaires, and then there are interviews where someone watches your face while you answer questions about how you handle being alone, and you learn after a while that the wrong answer isn't badly. The wrong answer is, I love it. They don't want someone who loves it. People who love isolation tend to have a reason, and the reason is usually the kind of thing that gets worse, not better, when you put them somewhere there's no one to see them. I gave the right answers. I said it was hard but manageable. I said I'd learned to keep a routine. The posting was listed as Station Farron 9, Atmospheric and Hydrological Monitoring, North Slope Interior, well above the Arctic Circle. The pay was good. It was a lot better than good, actually, and I noticed that, the way you notice a price tag that's too low on something you want. But I told myself remote postings always pay a premium, and that was true, so I let it be true. The drive-in took most of 2 days. You fly into Fairbanks, then a smaller plane to a strip near nothing, and then a man named Davenport picked me up in a vehicle built for the road, which is not a road in the sense most people mean. It's a graded track that the maintenance crews keep open in the months they can, and the rest of the year it belongs to the weather. Davenport didn't say much. He was the outgoing logistics coordinator, finishing his rotation, and I'd later understand that the things he didn't say were the most honest part of the conversation. What he did say, about an hour out, was this: you'll want to keep your logs current. Don't let them pile up. If you fall behind, it gets. And then he stopped, and finished with, it gets hard to catch up. I thought he meant the workload. That's the reasonable thing to think. The land out there doesn't have features the way you expect land to have features. There are no trees that far north, not really. You pass the last of them somewhere south of the pass, and after that it's tundra, and then in winter it's not even tundra, it's just white that goes to the edge of everything and stops only because your eyes give out before the land does. The sky in late autumn was the color of dishwater. The sun came up around 11 and gave up around 3, and even when it was up it wasn't really up. It hung there at the bottom of the sky like it was too tired to climb, and the light it gave was flat and shadowless, and made everything look like a photograph of itself. The station came up out of that flatness the way a ship comes up over the horizon. First the radar dome, the big white sphere of it, catching what little light there was. Then the main structure, low and long and the color of old steel. Then the outbuildings, the antenna array, the fuel tanks, the equipment masts standing up out of the snow with their instruments turning slowly in the wind. It was bigger than I expected. That was my first real thought, looking at it. For a weather station, for a place that's supposed to log temperatures and track storms and relay reports, it was bigger than it needed to be. There were structures I couldn't immediately assign a purpose to. A long low building set apart from the rest, half buried, with no windows. I asked Davenport what it was. He said, storage. I let that be true too. I was good at that in the beginning. Inside, the station was warm and dry and brightly lit, and the brightness was the kind that comes from fluorescent tubes. That even white that doesn't flicker but somehow makes you feel like it's flickering, just at the edge of your attention. The hallways were narrow and lined with conduit and pipe, and they hummed. The whole place hummed, the generators, the ventilation, the heating system, a constant low sound that you stopped hearing within an hour and never fully heard again, except sometimes at night when it would change pitch for no reason and you'd lie there listening to it and wondering if it had always done that. There were 6 of us, with me. That was the full complement. There was Marsh, the station chief, a woman in her 50s with a face that had been outdoors most of its life. There was Odia, who handled communications and the radio room. There was Petrick, the maintenance engineer, who kept the generators and the heating and the equipment running. There was Lindqvist, who did the hydrology work, the ice and water monitoring. And there was a man everyone called Coop, whose actual role I never fully understood. He was listed as site support. And he seemed to do a little of everything and a lot of nothing, and he was the one who watched the storms. I didn't know that last part yet. On the first day Coop just shook my hand and said welcome and asked if I'd eaten, and I said yes, and he nodded like that was the correct answer to a more important question. Marsh gave me the orientation. It was thorough and it was procedural and it was, in retrospect, very carefully constructed to tell me everything I needed to do my job and nothing about what the job actually was. She walked me through the logging procedures, the instrument checks, the relay schedule. Every 6 hours I'd take readings from the automated array and verify them against the manual instruments and log them in the system. Temperature, pressure, wind, precipitation, humidity, the full set. Then twice a day I'd compile the readings into a report, and Odia would relay it out. The relay window matters, Marsh said. We have a satellite uplink but it's not continuous up here. Odia knows the windows. You get your report to him before the window or it waits 12 hours. Don't miss the window. I said I understood. And there's a separate procedure, she said, for certain weather events. We'll cover that when one comes. I asked what kind of events. Severe systems, she said. There's an additional logging protocol. It's not complicated. Coop will walk you through it the first time. I asked why Coop and not her, and she looked at me for a second longer than the question warranted, and then she said, Coop's been here the longest. He knows the protocol best. That was the first thing that stuck. Not because it was strange in itself. Of course the most experienced person would train you on a procedure, but because of the way she said it. There was something underneath it. Not a warning. More like relief, maybe? Relief that it wasn't going to be her. The routine took hold fast, the way routines do when there's nothing else. You wake to an alarm because there's no daylight to wake you. You eat in the common room with whoever's awake, which is usually no one, because the shifts are staggered to keep someone on the instruments around the clock. You do your readings. You walk the array, which means going outside, which means the full ritual of the cold weather gear, the base layers, the insulated coveralls, the parka, the face protection, the goggles, the heavy mittens over liner gloves, because bare skin at those temperatures begins to die in under a minute. You go out into the dark and the wind and you check the instruments, and you scrape the ice off the sensors and you come back in and your eyelashes are frozen and your face is numb, and you log the numbers. And then you wait 6 hours and do it again. I want to convey what that does to you, because it matters for everything that came later. The isolation isn't dramatic. It isn't a single overwhelming feeling of loneliness. It's a slow erosion. There's no one to perform for, so you stop performing, and then you realize that a lot of what you thought was your personality was performance, and underneath it there's just habits. Routines. The shape of a person that's left when there's no one to be a person at. You start talking to yourself. Everyone does up there. You hear the others doing it through the walls, low murmurs, and you don't think it's strange because you're doing it too. And the quiet. I said I'd come back to the quiet. When the wind stops, and it does stop sometimes for hours, the silence outside is total in a way I had never experienced and don't have good words for. There's no traffic, no birds, no insects, no leaves, no water, nothing. Sound has nothing to travel through and nothing to bounce off. If you go outside in that silence and stand still, you can hear your own heart. You can hear the blood in your ears. And after a while you start to hear other things, not real things, I told myself, just the brain inventing sound to fill a space that has none. A kind of distant low pulse. A sense of something very large and very far away, breathing slowly. The brain does that. It's documented. I'd read about it. I told myself it was that. Coop told me, in my first week, "Don't stand out there in the quiet. It's not good for you." I asked what he meant. He said, "You'll go out to do the readings and you'll just stand there. Everybody does it the first time. The quiet gets into you. Just do your readings and come back in. Don't stand around listening." It was good advice. It was practical advice. It was the kind of thing an experienced person tells a new person about the psychological hazards of the environment. That's all it was, the way he said it. But he said don't stand around listening, and I thought about that word for a long time afterward. Listening, not lingering, not loitering. Listening, like there was something to hear, and the danger was in hearing it. The work was real. I want to be clear about that. The station genuinely monitored weather. The readings were genuine, the reports were genuine, the science was genuine. If you'd looked at what I did most days, you'd have seen a meteorologist doing meteorology in a hard place. That's what made it possible to not see the rest. The wrongness wasn't instead of the normal work. It was folded inside it, so that you'd have to already suspect it was there to find it. The first piece of it I found was a gap in the logs. I was reconciling the manual records against the digital archive, routine maintenance, making sure the backups matched, and I noticed a date in early October where the digital archive had a full day of readings and the manual log, the paper one, the one we kept as redundancy, had a single line drawn through the whole day. No readings. Just a line. And next to it, in handwriting I didn't recognize, one word, excluded. I asked Odia about it, because he was the one in the radio room when I found it. He looked at the page for a moment and said, "That'd be an excluded event. Coop logs those separately." I asked what an excluded event was. He said, "A storm that doesn't go in the regular record." And then, before I could ask the obvious next question, he said, "It's an old protocol. Atmospheric anomalies, sensor error events, that kind of thing. They get logged in a separate file so they don't contaminate the dataset. It's a data integrity thing." And he said it smoothly, the way you say something you've said many times, and he turned back to his equipment, and the conversation was over. Data integrity. That made sense. That actually made perfect sense. You don't want corrupted readings polluting a long-term climate record, so you flag and segregate anomalous data. Any scientist would understand that. I understood it. I was satisfied. Except that you don't draw a line through a whole day of readings and write excluded by hand in a paper log if it's a routine data integrity procedure. You note the anomaly, you flag the affected readings, you keep the data and mark it questionable. You don't erase a day. And you definitely don't do it in the manual redundancy log, where the whole point is that it's a permanent physical record that can't be quietly altered later. I didn't say any of that to Oduya. I just filed it away. That's the thing about that place. It taught you to file things away, to let them be true on the surface and keep the question underneath where no one could see it. I think now that's a survival skill the long-timers all had. The ones who couldn't do it, who needed the surface and the underneath to match, those were the ones who didn't last. Once I'd seen the first gap, I started seeing them everywhere. It became a kind of compulsion. In the slow hours, I'd pull old logs and cross-reference them. The excluded events weren't frequent, maybe one every 3 or 4 weeks, going back as far as the records went, which was further than I'd assumed. The station was older than it looked. The earliest logs were on paper, decades old, the handwriting changing as the people changed, but the protocol staying the same. A storm would come. It would get logged in the regular record like anything else for the first while. And then at a certain point, always the same kind of point, the regular log would just stop for that system, and a line would appear, and a word, excluded, and somewhere there'd be a separate notation that Coop, or whoever held Coop's role before him, had taken over the logging. The excluded storms had something in common, and it took me a while to see it because it was an absence rather than a presence. They didn't have names. We named our storms. Not the official hurricane-style naming, but an internal convention. Every significant system got a working designation, a date code and a sequential letter, so we could refer to it in reports and communications. It's standard practice. You need a way to say this storm and not that storm. The excluded storms had no designation. In the separate file, and I found the separate file eventually, though it took weeks and I'm not proud of how I found it, they were just numbered. Not named. Numbered. And the numbers were high. The file I found started, at the top of its visible records, at something like 1,140. By the time I'd been there a few months we were past 1,160. Over 1,100 of them. Going back who knows how long. Storms that came, that were tracked, and then erased from the record and assigned a number in a file that wasn't supposed to exist. I didn't understand what the numbers meant. I still don't, not fully. But I'll tell you what I came to believe, later, in the worst part of it, and you can decide for yourself whether I'd lost my grip by then. I came to believe the numbers weren't counting storms. I came to believe they were counting the same thing, arriving over and over. But that's getting ahead. The radio was the next thing. Oduya ran the radio room, but everyone took shifts monitoring the bands, because part of the station's function was relaying communications for the few other installations and parties operating in that part of the interior. There weren't many. A research camp 200 miles southeast. A pipeline monitoring point. A couple of automated relays. And on certain frequencies, traffic I was told not to log. That's how it was phrased. Marsh told me, going over the radio procedures. These frequencies you monitor and relay. These you monitor and log. And this band here. She pointed at a range on the set. You monitor and you do not log. If you hear traffic on it, you note the time, you note that there was traffic, and you do nothing else. You don't transcribe it. You don't respond. You note the time. I asked who was on that band. She said, sometimes nobody. Sometimes weather does strange things to radio up here. You'll hear voices that aren't anybody. Atmospheric ducting, skip propagation, it carries signals from a long way off and scrambles them. It sounds like people. It isn't. That again is true. Radio propagation in the far north does strange things. The aurora itself affects it. You really can hear ghost signals, fragments of distant broadcasts, voices that bounced halfway around the planet. I'd heard them before, at other stations. They're eerie but they're explicable. So the first time I heard the band, I was prepared for it to be eerie and explicable. It was during a quiet shift, deep in the dark hours. The regular bands were silent. I had the monitor on the do not log band turned low, the way you do, just to have something to listen to, and at first it was just static, that wide, soft, oceanic static that fills the dead air. And then under the static there was a voice. It was a man's voice, and it was calm, and it was reading numbers. Just numbers, in sequence, in a flat affectless tone. That's not strange in itself. Number stations are real, they've existed since the Cold War. Automated voices reading numbers for purposes nobody outside intelligence services fully knows. I'd heard those too. So I listened to it read numbers, and I noted the time, and I prepared to be unbothered. And then the numbers it was reading started matching the numbers on my screen. I was mid-shift, which meant I had instrument readings up. Pressure, temperature, the live feed from the array. And the voice on the radio, the calm flat voice reading its sequence, it read the pressure. The exact value, to the decimal, that was displayed on my screen in that moment. Then it read the temperature. Then the wind speed. It read my readings, in order, in real time, in a voice that had no business knowing them, on a band that wasn't supposed to carry anything but ghosts. I sat very still. I told myself it was coincidence, that number stations read 4-digit groups, and that any sequence of 4-digit groups will eventually seem to match something if you want it to. I told myself that. And then the voice paused, and there was a silence, and then it read a value that wasn't on my screen yet, a pressure reading lower than anything I was seeing, and 4 minutes later the pressure on my screen dropped to exactly that value as a front I hadn't been tracking moved in. I turned the monitor off. I noted the time, as instructed. I did nothing else. In the morning I told Oduya carefully that I'd heard something odd on the band. He didn't ask what. He just nodded and said, "You noted the time?" I said yes. He said, "Good. That's all you do." And then he said something I think about constantly. He said, "It reads ahead sometimes. Don't act on it. Whatever it tells you before it happens, you log the time, you don't act on it. If you start steering by it, that's how people get into trouble." That's how people get into trouble. Like it had happened. Like there was a specific way that people who acted on the voice got into trouble, and he'd seen it. The safety routines were the third thing, and they were the strangest, because they were the most ordinary on the surface and the most senseless underneath. There was a procedure for severe weather that went beyond anything the cold or the wind could justify. When a major system was inbound, we'd do the normal storm prep, secure the outbuildings, top off the generators, bring in anyone who was outside. That all made sense. But then there was the rest of it. We covered the windows. Not shuttered them against wind, covered them, with heavy blackout panels that lived in a closet for exactly this purpose, so that during the worst of a storm you could not see out, and, the point seemed to be, nothing could see in. We turned off the exterior lights. All of them, even the ones that marked the structures for safety, the ones you'd absolutely want on if someone were caught outside. We were not to go outside during an excluded event, no matter what. And we were not to respond to anything we heard. That was the part Coop emphasized when he finally walked me through the protocol, during my first excluded event, about 2 months in. "During one of these," he said, "you might hear things outside. Knocking. Voices. Somebody calling your name. You will not go out. You will not answer. You will not go to a window even if the panel's up and you want to look." He said it flat, like reciting. "If you hear someone outside calling for help, it is not someone. Everyone who's supposed to be inside is inside. We do a count before we seal up. If the count is right, then anything outside is not a person. Do you understand?" I said I understood. He looked at me and said, "You don't, but you will." The first excluded event I lived through mostly in my bunk, because Marsh had me off shift for it. "Your first one, you don't work it," she said. "Coop works it. You stay in your room. If you can sleep, sleep." I didn't sleep. The storm came in over about 6 hours, and I tracked its approach on the instruments before they had me cover the window in my room. It built normally at first, pressure dropping, wind rising, the temperature doing the strange climb that sometimes precedes the worst cold, where it warms just before it plunges. Standard frontal behavior. And then around the time it got close, the readings started doing things I couldn't explain. The pressure dropped further than the instruments were rated to read. The wind speed climbed and then the anemometer just stopped. Not broke. Stopped, reading 0, in the middle of what sounded like the loudest part of the storm. The temperature readout fluctuated wildly, swinging 20, 30 degrees in seconds, which is not physically possible, which means either the sensors were failing or the air itself was doing something air does not do. And the sound. A storm at that latitude is loud. The wind is a physical thing, it shakes the structure, it screams in the masts and the antenna guys. I knew that sound. But underneath it, that night, there was another sound, and it was not the wind. It was lower. It was slower. It had a rhythm to it, a long, slow rhythm, and the closest I can come to describing it is that it sounded like the breathing I'd imagined in the silence, except now it wasn't in the silence, it was in the storm, and it wasn't imagined, because Petrick heard it too, I found out later, and so did Lindqvist, and none of us talked about it the next day. And once, near the worst of it, I heard a knock. It was on the exterior wall of my room. 3 times, deliberate, spaced. not the random battering of debris. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, at the height a person's hand would be. I did not go to the window. I did not answer. I lay in my bunk in the dark with the blackout panel up, and I counted the hum of the ventilation, and I waited, and after a while there were 3 more knocks, lower down, near the floor, and after that there was nothing, and eventually the storm passed, and in the morning the sun did its tired half rise and the world was white and silent, and there were no tracks in the snow outside my window. None. The fresh snow was smooth and unbroken right up to the wall. There was nowhere for whatever knock to have stood. And there were no tracks leaving. I checked the count from the night before, the personnel count Coop had logged before sealing up. 6. All 6 of us, accounted for, inside. So whatever knocked was not a person. Coop had told me that. If the count is right, then anything outside is not a person. I'd thought he was being dramatic. I understood now that he was being precise. He wasn't describing a danger. He was describing a fact about the world that the station already knew, and had a procedure for, and did not discuss. I started losing time around then. Or that's when I started noticing it. It worked like this. I'd be doing a task, a routine task, instrument readings, a walk of the array, and then I'd be somewhere else, doing something else, with a gap in between that I couldn't account for. Not a long gap, at first. Minutes. I'd be scraping ice off a sensor, and then I'd be back inside taking off my gear, and I wouldn't remember the walk back. The way you sometimes drive a familiar route and arrive without memory of the trip. I told myself it was that. Highway hypnosis. The brain on autopilot. But it got longer. Once I lost the whole shift. I logged the midnight readings. I have the log, in my handwriting, time-stamped. And then the next thing I have any memory of is the 6 a.m. readings, and the log shows I took the 3 a.m. readings in between, in my handwriting, accurate, but I have no memory of taking them. 3 hours gone, but worked. I did my job through a window of time I have no access to. I asked Patrick carefully whether the long dark messed with people's memory. He said, "Everybody's a little off up here. You'll find chunks missing. It's the dark and the routine. Everything's the same so the days don't anchor." Then he was quiet for a second and added, "Long as your logs are right, don't worry about it. The logs are right, you did the work. That's all that matters. The logs are right, you did the work," as if the log was more reliable than the memory. As if the question of whether I'd actually experienced those hours was less important than whether the record showed they'd been handled. And I realized that everyone there treated the logs that way, as the real record of reality, more trustworthy than any person's memory. The log was the truth. What you remembered was just weather in your head. Which is a comforting way to live, until you find a log in your own handwriting recording a conversation you don't remember having, with a person who, you'll later become quite sure, was not at the station that week. That happened. I want to tell it carefully because it's the kind of thing that, if I tell it wrong, makes me sound like I'd simply lost my mind, and maybe I had, but the log exists, or it existed, and I read it more than once. There was a procedural log we kept in the common room, separate from the weather logs, just a running record of station business, maintenance done, supplies used, people coming and going. Routine. And in it, in my handwriting, time-stamped to an afternoon I half remembered, was an entry that read, * spoke with Reyes array calibration. Reyes recommends recalibrating sensor 4 after next event. Logged for Patrick. *. There was no Reyes. There had never been a Reyes, not in my time. 6 of us, Marsh, Odia, Patrick, Lindqvist, Coop, and me. No Reyes. I asked Marsh who Reyes was. I tried to ask it lightly. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Where did you hear that name?" I said I'd seen it in the procedural log. In my handwriting. She came and looked at the entry. She read it twice. And then she said, "Reyes was the atmospheric specialist before you." She said it slowly. "Reyes rotated out the week before you came in." I said that wasn't possible. I'd written that entry on a date weeks into my own posting. Reyes couldn't have recommended a recalibration to me weeks after Reyes had left, before I arrived. Marsh looked at the entry for a long time. And then she closed the log and she said, "Sometimes the station holds on to people. Their routines stay in the building. You'll catch yourself doing things the last person did. Saying things they said." She paused. "Don't chase it. It doesn't lead anywhere good. Just, if you write down a conversation you don't remember having, draw a line through it and put excluded." Excluded. The same word. The same word they used for the storms. I understood then, sitting in that bright humming room, that the storms and the missing time and the ghost name in my own handwriting were not three separate strangenesses. They were one strangeness, and it had a procedure, and the procedure was the same for all of it: notice, contain, erase, don't chase. The station wasn't confused about what was happening. The station knew exactly what was happening. It had known for over 1100 events. It had simply decided, long ago, that the only way to survive what it was watching was to never let the watching become knowledge. To keep it all in the excluded file. To draw the line through the day. The big storm, the one I think of as the storm, though I know now there's no such thing as the storm, there's only ever the one storm wearing different weather, started showing up on the long-range data about a week out. It shouldn't have been there. I mean that technically. The synoptic pattern didn't support it. There was no front, no low, no mechanism. The models we ran showed clear, cold, stable conditions for the region for the next 10 days. And yet on the long-range radar, at the very edge of range, there was a return. A mass. It didn't move like a storm. Storms move with the steering flow, they track along the upper-level winds. This thing moved against the flow. It came in from the north, off the ice, against a wind that should have pushed it back, and it came slowly and steadily, and it did not deviate, like something walking. I showed it to Co-op. I expected him to dismiss it, to explain it. Instead he looked at it for a long moment, and his face did something I hadn't seen it do. It went still. Not calm. Still, the way an animal goes still. He said, "How long out?" I said about a week, at its current speed. He said, "It'll be slower than that. It always takes longer than the speed says. Days longer." And then he said, "I need to tell the others." And he left, and that night Marsh called the first all-hands meeting I'd been to. It wasn't dramatic. That's what I keep coming back to. None of it was ever dramatic. It was the most procedural meeting imaginable. Marsh went over the storm prep checklist. She assigned tasks. She moved the rotation around so we'd have full coverage through the event and rest before it. She had Petrick confirm the generator fuel and the backup. She had Odia confirm the relay schedule and reminded everyone about the do not log band. She had Lindqvist secure the hydrology equipment. And then, at the end, she said, "This one's a long one. Going to be the longest we've had in a while. So I want to go over the protocol carefully, because the new procedures matter most when it's long." And she went over it. The window panels. The lights off. The count before sealing. No going outside. No answering anything. No going to the windows. And then a new one Coop hadn't told me. If it goes long enough that we lose track of days, and it might, we hold to the readings scheduled by the clock, not by light or dark, or how tired you are. The clock is the truth. You take a reading every 6 hours by the clock, even if the clock is the only thing you trust. Especially if the clock is the only thing you trust. I asked, because I couldn't not ask. What happens if it goes really long? There was a silence. And Lindqvist, who almost never spoke, said quietly, "Last long one, we lost Halpern." Marsh said sharply, "That's not," and stopped. And Coop said, in the flat reciting voice, "Halpern went to a window. During. He said there was someone outside who knew him. He went to the window and then he went to the door, and we couldn't. And he stopped too. And nobody finished it." And Marsh said, "We're not losing anybody this time. Hold the protocol. The protocol works. 1100 times it's worked." And I thought, 1100 times, and I understood she'd seen the file too, that everyone had, that the number was a thing they all carried. The storm took 9 days to cross the distance a real storm crosses in 2. Coop was right. It was slower than the speed said. It came against the wind the whole way, and as it came, the station changed. Not physically. The people changed. Or settled. They got quieter and flatter and more precise, like instruments being tuned down. The small talk stopped. The self-talk I'd heard through the walls stopped. Everyone moved through their tasks with a kind of conserving economy, like people rationing something. I understand it now as a defense. You make yourself small and procedural and you give the thing outside as little of yourself as possible to hold on to, because what it holds on to, it takes. I found the hidden records on the 4th day before it hit, when I couldn't sleep and the building was dark and I went looking, the way you do when you've stopped being able to not know. The excluded file I'd found before was just the surface, the numbered events, the dates, the bare logging. The real records were in the windowless building. The one Davenport had called storage. I'd never been inside it, nobody had a reason to go there, and that, I see now, was the point. But I'd watched Coop go in once with a key from a board in Marsh's office, and the board was not locked, and at 3 in the morning on the 4th day I took the key and I went out across the snow under a sky full of aurora, green light moving like something alive, the only motion in all that white, and I let myself in. It was cold inside, unheated, and it was full of shelves, and the shelves were full of paper. Decades of it. The complete record of every excluded event, going back to the founding of the station, which was much earlier than I'd assumed. The earliest documents were from a period and an agency that no longer exist under the names on the letterhead. The station had been built for this. It had never been a weather station that happened to notice something. It had always been a watching post, and the weather monitoring was the body it wore. I couldn't read all of it. I had maybe an hour before the cold drove me out. But I read enough. I won't tell you it explained everything, because it didn't, and I've come to think the not explaining was deliberate, that the people who kept these records understood that the worst thing you could do was understand. The documents weren't analysis. They were observation. Careful, restrained, terrified observation, written by people who had clearly decided that their job was to watch and record and contain and never, ever, to interpret. But there were patterns. The events came on a cycle that wasn't quite regular, clustering and thinning over years, but always returning. Each event was described in the same careful language, the approach against the prevailing flow, the instrument failures, the sound, the things at the windows and the doors. The voices that knew people's names. The way the storm seemed to read ahead. And every event ended the same way. The storm passes, the records are sealed, the event is excluded, and this was the part that stayed with me. A note, in every file, in the hand of whoever was chief at the time. * no acknowledgement sent. Per protocol, event not reported up. * not reported up. To anyone. The whole apparatus of the station, the satellite uplink, the relay schedule, all of it, none of it ever carried word of these events to anyone above. The reports we sent out were the regular weather. The excluded events stayed in the building, in the cold, in the dark, on paper, and went nowhere. For decades. Because, and I think this is the truth of it, the closest I came to understanding, the station's purpose was not to warn anyone. You cannot warn anyone about this. There is nothing to be done about it. The station's purpose was to be there. To be a place that watches, so that the watching happens, so that the thing in the storms is observed, because, and here I'm guessing, here I'm putting words to what the records never said, because as long as it is watched, it stays in the storms. The watching is the containment. The procedure isn't to survive the thing. The procedure is to keep witnessing it without ever letting the witness escape into the world as knowledge, because knowledge of it is the door it comes through, and the people who run that station have understood for a very long time that the only safe knowledge is knowledge kept in the cold and the dark and never reported up. Halpern went to the window. He let it become someone he knew. He opened the knowledge a crack, and the crack was a door. I read until my hand stopped working, and then I put everything back exactly as I'd found it, and I returned the key to the board, and I went to my bunk, and I did not sleep, and in the morning I took the 6 a.m. readings by the clock and I said nothing to anyone, and the storm came. The storm. I worked it. That was the difference this time. I was on the rotation, I was at the instruments through the worst of it, and so I have it, all of it, in a way I don't have the first one. Though, have, is the wrong word. It's not a clean memory. It's a memory with holes in it, and the holes are part of the memory, the way the silences in the radio were part of the signal. It hit at dusk on the 9th day, which up there meant it hit in the dark, because by then there was barely any day at all. We sealed up. Marsh did the count, 6. All present. The panels went up. The exterior lights went off. The building closed itself like a hand closing, and the only light was the fluorescent white inside and the green glow of the instruments. And the only sound was the hum and building beyond the walls, the storm. The readings did what I now expected. Pressure off the bottom of the scale. The anemometer climbing and then stopping dead at 0 in the heart of the wind. The temperature swinging impossibly. And the sound underneath the wind, the slow breathing rhythm, louder this time, closer, with the wind itself seeming to organize around it, to fall into its rhythm, so that the storm wasn't making the sound, the storm was the sound's exhalation. I held to the clock. Every 6 hours, readings. And somewhere in there the clock became the only thing, because Marsh had been right, we lost the days. There was no day. There was only the inside of the storm, which had no time in it, and the clock on the wall, which I clung to like a railing in the dark. Midnight readings. 6 a.m. readings. The numbers themselves stopped meaning anything, they were physically impossible, they described an atmosphere that couldn't exist, but I logged them, because logging them was the procedure, and the procedure was the only thing holding the shape of a person together inside that noise. The radio, on the do not log band, never stopped. The calm flat voice, reading. I'd turned the monitor off but Odia had to keep his on, to hold the relay open, and you could hear it leaking out of the radio room, the voice reading numbers, and the numbers were my readings, and then the numbers were readings I hadn't taken yet, and then, and this is the part I'm least sure of, this is the part that might be the missing time talking, then the voice stopped reading numbers and started reading names. It read Halpern. It read Reyes. It read names I didn't know, dozens of them, a long slow list in the flat calm voice, and I understood that it was reading everyone the station had ever lost, everyone who'd gone to a window, everyone whose routine stayed in the building after they were gone, and I understood that it was a roll call, and that it was not finished, and that there was a space at the end of it where a name had not yet been read. And then there was a knock. Not on my wall. On the main door. The sealed door, the one we did not open. 3 knocks, deliberate, spaced. And then a voice, not the radio voice, a real voice, a warm human voice, muffled by the wind and the steel, and it called my name. My actual name. And it said it was cold, and it said it had been walking, and it said it just needed to come in for a minute, and it knew me, it said it knew me, it used a detail about my life that I had told no one at that station, a thing only I knew, and the voice knew it, and the voice was so reasonable and so cold and so familiar that I was standing at the door before I knew I'd moved. I don't remember crossing the room. That's a hole in the memory. I was at the instruments, and then I was at the door with my hand on the seal, and the voice on the other side was saying my name softly, kindly, the way someone says your name when they love you and they're worried about you, and I had the seal half released. I could feel the cold coming through, the impossible cold, the cold from the bottom of the scale, and Coop's arms were around me from behind, pulling me back, and Marsh was throwing the seal closed. And Coop was saying into my ear, flat and steady, the recitation, the count is right, everyone inside is inside, that is not a person, the count is right, saying it over and over until it became the only thing in my head, louder than the voice outside, and the voice outside stopped, and then there were 3 knocks slowed down near the floor, and then nothing, and the storm went on. I had been at that station 4 months and I never told anyone the detail the voice used. I have never told anyone. It's not in this account either. I want you to understand, the thing outside knew something about me that did not exist in the world. It was not reading my mind. It was reading ahead, the way it read the instruments ahead. It knew the version of me that would tell that detail to someone, someday, and it called to that version, and that version was real enough to walk me to the door. That's what's in the storms. Not a creature. I never saw a creature, there is no creature to see. What's in the storms is the part of you that doesn't exist yet. The future tense of yourself. And it's cold, and it's been walking, and it knows your name, and it just needs to come in for a minute. The storm passed on what the clock said was the 4th day. Maybe it was 4 days. The clock said 4. I'll hold to the clock. It passed the way they all pass. The wind dropped. The breathing sound thinned out and faded and became wind again, and then became silence. The pressure climbed back onto the scale. The anemometer woke up. Marsh waited a full 6 hours after the instruments normalized. Protocol, and then we took the panels down, and the exterior lights came on, and outside the snow was smooth and white and unbroken in every direction, right up to the walls, with no tracks, with nothing, with the tired sun coming up over the edge of all that white as if nothing had happened, because as far as the world was ever going to know, nothing had. We did the after procedure. We logged the event in the excluded file. Coop assigned it its number. I won't tell you the number. We sealed the records and put them in the cold building. And Marsh wrote, in her hand, in the file, * no acknowledgement sent. Per protocol, event not reported up, *. And then we drew the line through the days. Through the regular logs, the 4 days the storm had lasted, a line, and the word excluded, as if the time had not happened. And here is the thing I cannot explain and have stopped trying to. Once the line was drawn, I started to lose the memory of it. Not all at once. The way frost retreats from a window in the sun, you don't see it go, you only see that it's gone. The 4 days got thin. The voice at the door got far away. By the time my rotation ended, I could barely hold on to it, and the only reason I can tell it to you now is that I broke the protocol one last time. I didn't draw the line through my own memory. I wrote it down. I wrote down everything in secret, on paper I took out with me, against every instruction, because I needed there to be one record that wasn't excluded. I think that was a mistake. I think the protocol was right and I was wrong. Because the records in that cold building stayed in the cold building and went nowhere and harmed no one, and the thing in the storms stayed in the storms, watched and contained and unreported, for over 1,100 returns. And I took the record out into the world. I let the knowledge through the door. I left at the end of my rotation. Davenport's replacement drove me out the Nata Road in the half-light, and I looked back once at the radar dome catching the low sun, and then it went down below the white horizon like a ship going under, and I came home. But I want to tell you what home is like now, because this is the part that I think matters most, the part that's the actual horror, the part that doesn't pass. The storms followed me. Not literally, there are no Arctic storms where I live now. But the missing time came with me. I lose hours. I find things in my handwriting I don't remember writing. Last week I found a note to myself that said Reyes recommends recalibrating sensor 4, and there is no sensor 4 here, there is no Reyes, there is no station, and I wrote it, in this house, at a date stamped 3 days ago, and I have no memory of writing it, and when I found it I felt the cold come through the floor. And on certain nights, when the wind picks up, any wind, ordinary wind, I hear it underneath. The slow breathing rhythm. Far off, the way it was in the silence at the beginning, before I knew what the silence was. And the radio in my car, when it's between stations, in the static, sometimes there's a voice reading numbers, and the numbers are things about my day, my real day, things that haven't happened yet, and I have learned to turn it off and note the time and do nothing, because Odia was right, you do not act on what it tells you, that's how people get into trouble. I keep the protocol now. Out here, where there's no station and no marsh and no count to be right. I keep the windows covered on bad nights. I do not answer the door to voices I recognize. I hold to the clock. And I keep waiting because the record said the events come on a cycle, clustering and thinning but always returning, and I took a piece of it out with me, I let the knowledge through, and I don't think it forgets a debt like that. There's a space at the end of the roll call. I told you that. A space where a name hasn't been read yet. I don't know whose name goes there. I tell myself I don't know. But on the bad nights, when the wind is breathing and the static is reading my tomorrow back to me in that calm, flat voice, I notice I've stopped putting my own record in the cold and the dark where it belongs. I notice I've been telling it. To you? Right now. Letting it through the door, one listener at a time. And somewhere very far north, in a building with no windows, in the cold, there's a file with a number on it, and the number went up by one the day I left, and I've started to think the number was never counting storms at all. I've started to think it was counting us. The count has to be right. That's the whole protocol. The count has to be right, or the thing outside is not a person. I keep counting. I keep coming up one short. I should stop telling you this now. I've said more than the protocol allows, and I can feel the cold coming up through the floor, and outside, very faint, very far away, under an ordinary wind, something has started to breathe. I'm going to note the time. I'm going to